Well, hello there, welcome back. Tonight I need you to forget everything you think you know about the Victorian era. Forget the grand ballrooms, the elegant top hats, the crisp white gloves and the gilded carriages rolling through Hyde Park. Because tonight we're not visiting that world. Tonight we're going somewhere far less comfortable. We're stepping into a London you can smell before you can see a London of open sewers, coal smoke so thick it stains your teeth, and rooms so small that 6 people sleep in a space barely fit for 2. This is the London of poor Victorian women, and I'll be honest with you, if you had been born a woman in the slums of 1850s London, the odds were stacked against you in ways that would make your modern problems feel like mild inconveniences. You probably wouldn't last a week without running water, central heating, or a single day off. These women lasted entire lifetimes. So before you settle in tonight, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It makes a real difference, and I appreciate every single one of you. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are now? I always love reading those comments in the morning. Now dim the lights, let your breathing slow, and imagine yourself waking up in a place where comfort is a word that belongs to someone else. The first thing you notice is the cold. Not a crisp, pleasant winter chill. Not the kind that makes you want to pull a cozy blanket tighter and sip hot cocoa. No, this is a damp, bone-settling cold that has seeped into the walls, into the floor, into the very mattress beneath you, if you can even call it a mattress. What you're lying on is closer to a sack of straw, lumpy and flattened from years of use shared between you and at least 2 others. The room is dark, not the kind of dark you experience when you switch off your bedroom light and the glow of a phone screen still hums nearby. This is a thick, soupy darkness broken only by the faintest grey line creeping through a window no bigger than a dinner plate. That window doesn't open properly. It hasn't for years. The glass is cracked and stuffed with rags to keep out the worst of the draught, though it doesn't do a particularly good job. You can feel the cold air threading through like thin, icy fingers reaching for your skin. You're a woman, you are poor. And it's approximately 4:30 in the morning in the East End of London, sometime in the 1850s. Your day has already begun. Here's a mainstream historical fact that might surprise you. At the height of the Victorian era, nearly 30% of London's population lived in what social reformers classified as poverty or extreme poverty. That means roughly 1 in 3 people you would have passed on the street were struggling to afford basic food and shelter. And among those women, particularly unmarried women, widows and mothers with absent husbands were disproportionately represented. The Victorian ideal of the angel in the house, that serene, gentle creature who managed a beautiful home and raised rosy-cheeked children, was a fantasy reserved for the middle and upper classes. For the poor there were no angels, only survivors. You swing your legs off the straw mattress and your bare feet hit the floor. The sensation is immediate and unpleasant, cold, slightly damp wood that feels gritty beneath your toes. The room smells of stale bodies of smoke from last night's small fire that has long since gone out, and something faintly sour that you've learned not to investigate too closely. You share this single room with your family. Perhaps it's a mother and 2 siblings. Perhaps it's a husband and 3 children. The arrangements vary, but the cramped reality does not. In many tenement buildings across Whitechapel, Bethnal Green and St Giles, entire families occupied a single room no larger than 12 feet by 10. Some rooms held even more people. Lodgers were common. A stranger paying a few pence a week to sleep in the corner was not unusual, it was necessary. Every penny counted, and privacy was a luxury as foreign as silk. Now here's a curious detail that historians love to mention. In some of the worst slum housing, the beds operated on a shift system. You didn't rent a bed for the night, you rented it for 8 hours. When your shift was up, someone else climbed in the sheet, still warm from your body. They called these places hotbeds, and the name had nothing to do with romance, it was pure economics. A landlord could triple the income from a single mattress by running it in 3 shifts. The very concept of a bed being yours, a personal space, where you retreat from the world that simply didn't exist here. You dress quickly, and by dress, I mean you pull on the same clothes you wore yesterday and the day before that, and quite possibly every day for the past several months. You own perhaps 2 sets of clothing if you're fortunate, one for daily wear, one kept slightly cleaner for Sundays, because even in the deepest poverty there was a fierce, quiet pride about presenting yourself decently for church. Your dress is heavy, dark fabric, likely a deep brown or grey that hides the worst of the stains. It's patched in several places. The hem is frayed. Underneath you wear a chemise that hasn't been properly washed in weeks, because washing takes time, takes soap, takes water that must be hauled from a shed pumped down the street. The whole process is exhausting and you haven't even stepped outside yet. The corset question is an interesting one and historians still argue about it. The popular image of Victorian women laced into impossibly tight corsets until they could barely breathe, that's largely a middle and upper class phenomenon, and even then the extreme tight lacing was rarer than fiction suggests. Poor women often wore some form of stays or a simple bodice for support, but the rigid whale-boned contraptions you see in period dramas were expensive and impractical for a woman who spent her days scrubbing, lifting and hauling. Some researchers suggest that working-class women adapted their undergarments for mobility rather than fashion, while others argue that even poor women aspired to the silhouette of their social betters and would wear whatever version of a corset they could afford. The truth, as with most things in history, probably lies somewhere in the messy middle. You move to the small fireplace. There are a few embers still glowing faintly beneath a layer of ash, and you coax them back to life with whatever scraps of fuel. You have a handful of coal. If you're lucky, dried wood chips, maybe even old bones or vegetable peelings that have been dried and saved for this purpose. The fire is everything. It is your stove, your heater, your light source in the grey pre-dawn gloom. You set a small pot of water over it to boil because the first task of the day before anything else, before feeding the children or emptying the chamber pot or stepping outside into the chaos of the street, is tea. Even the poorest families in Victorian London drank tea. It was cheap, it was warm, and the boiling water made it safer than the alternative, which was drinking straight from the Thames-fed water supply, a decision that could quite literally kill you. Cholera didn't care how brave you were. The tea is weak. You have reused these leaves before and they're more memory than flavour now. But the warmth of the cup between your hands, chipped, slightly, cracked the handle, long since broken off, is real. You wrap your fingers around it and for just a moment you stand still. The children are not yet awake. The street outside is beginning to stir, the low rumble of cartwheels on cobblestone reaching you, through the thin walls the distant clatter of a milk pail, the sharp bark of a dog. But here in this tiny pocket of near silence you have 30 seconds that belong only to you. You breathe in the steam. It smells of almost nothing, just faintly of tannin and smoke. You take a sip. It's bitter and barely warm enough, but it is yours, and that matters more than you might think. Because today will take everything from you. Today, like every day, will demand your hands, your back, your patience, and your silence. And you will give it all, not because you are brave in the way that history. Books celebrate bravery with swords and speeches and grand gestures, but because there is simply no alternative. The children will need to eat. The landlord will need his rent. The world outside that cracked window does not pause for exhaustion. You finish the tea, you rinse the cup with a splash of cold water, and you open the door. The smell hits you first. It always does. The hallway of the tenement is narrow and dark, and the smell is a living thing. A thick-layered cocktail of boiled cabbage, human waste, damp plaster, and something sweetly rotten that you stopped trying to identify months ago. You've learned to breathe through your mouth for the first few steps, then your nose adjusts, or rather your nose surrenders. The walls are stained with streaks of moisture that never fully dry, and the plaster is crumbling in patches, exposing the bare brick beneath like old wounds that refuse to heal. The staircase creaks beneath your weight as you descend each step, a small negotiation with wood that feels soft and unreliable. Someone has left a bucket on the landing. You don't look inside it. You already know. Outside, the street is waking. The sky is a flat yellowish grey, that particular shade of London dawn that never quite commits to daylight. The air is heavy with coal smoke. It sits on your tongue, faintly metallic, faintly bitter, and it clings to your hair and your clothes like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. You pull your shawl tighter around your shoulders. It's thin, this shawl, a dark woolen thing that was probably a decent garment once years ago before it was handed down or bought second-hand from a rag dealer in Petticoat Lane. Now it is your armour. It is the only barrier between your skin and the damp morning air, and it does its job poorly, but you are grateful for it nonetheless. You are heading to work. And for a poor Victorian woman in the 1850s, work most commonly meant one thing: domestic service. If you were employed in a wealthy household, you were part of an invisible army that kept the grand machinery of upper-class life running smoothly. Here is a fact that speaks volumes about the era. By the middle of the 19th century, domestic service was the single largest category of employment for women in England. At its peak, over 1.5 million women worked as servants. That's not a small number tucked away in a footnote. That is an enormous portion of the female population spending their lives cleaning, cooking, polishing and scrubbing inside homes they would never own for families who often couldn't remember their names. You arrive at the servants' entrance. Not the front door, of course. Never the front door. The front door is for the family, for their guests, for people who matter in the social arithmetic of Victorian England. You enter through the side or the back, down a short flight of steps into the basement level where the kitchen and scullery live in permanent semi-darkness. The transition is immediate. Outside you are a person walking down a street. In here you are a function. You are a pair of hands attached to a list of tasks that will take you from before dawn until well after the family has retired to their warm, candle-lit bedrooms upstairs. Your first job is the fireplace, not one fireplace, several. A large household might have 8, 10, even 15 fireplaces, and every single one of them needs to be cleaned, relaid and lit before the family wakes. You kneel on cold stone floors with a small brush and a bucket, scooping out yesterday's ash, scrubbing the grate with blacklead until it shines, then carefully building a new fire with paper kindling and coal. The blacklead gets everywhere. It coats your hands, your wrists, your forearms, and works its way under your nails where it will stay for days no matter how hard you scrub. Your knees ache. The stone is unforgiving, and the thin fabric of your dress offers no cushion. You move from room to room, repeating the process, carrying your bucket and brush like a soldier carries a rifle. It is simply part of you now. Here's a curious detail that paints a vivid picture of the power dynamics at play. In many households, servants were required to be completely invisible. If a maid encountered a member of the family in a hallway, she was expected to turn and face the wall until they passed. Some households even had separate staircases, one for the family, one for the servants specifically, so that the two worlds would never accidentally collide. You could work in a house for years and rarely make eye contact with the people whose sheets you washed and whose food you prepared. You were a ghost who scrubbed floors. After the fireplaces come the chamber pots. This is the task that no one romanticizes, and for good reason. Every bedroom in the house has a chamber pot, a ceramic bowl tucked discreetly beneath the bed or inside a small wooden cabinet, and every morning those pots need to be collected, carried downstairs, emptied and cleaned. The smell is exactly what you imagine. You hold your breath where you can, but the house is large, the pots are many, and breathing is unfortunately not optional. You carry them carefully because spilling is a disaster you cannot afford, not because of the mess, but because of the punishment. A clumsy servant is a replaceable servant, and there are dozens of women waiting outside the registry office who would take your position in a heartbeat. And here's where historians still have a lively debate. The question of how servants were actually treated varies enormously depending on the household, the region, and the period. Some historians paint a picture of near-feudal oppression. Servants worked to exhaustion, were poorly fed, harshly disciplined and dismissed without reference for the smallest infraction. Others argue that many households operated with a degree of mutual respect and even genuine affection between employer and servant, particularly in smaller homes, where the relationship was closer and more personal. The truth, as always, is that both realities existed simultaneously. Your experience as a domestic servant depended almost entirely on the temperament of the people who employed you, and you had very little power to change your situation if that temperament turned cruel. The morning continues. You dust the parlour, polish the silverware, sweep the carpets, and by sweep, I mean you get on your hands and knees with a stiff brush and work your way across the floor inch by inch, because vacuum cleaners won't exist for another half-century. You beat the rugs outside, hanging them over a line and striking them with a flat wooden paddle, until clouds of dust rise around your face and settle in your lungs. The repetitive motion makes your shoulders burn. Your lower back has developed a permanent low-grade ache that you've stopped noticing. The way you stop noticing the ticking of a clock, it's simply always there, part of the background noise of your body. By mid-morning you might be allowed a brief pause to eat. The servants' meals are taken in the kitchen, usually at a long plain table. The food is simple bread, perhaps some cold meat or cheese tea. In wealthier households, the servants ate reasonably well, receiving leftovers from the family's meals. In less generous homes, the diet was monotonous and thin. You eat quickly, not because anyone is watching, but because the habit of hurrying has been trained into your muscles. Leisure is suspicious, stillness is laziness. A good servant is a moving servant, and you learn that lesson early. The afternoon brings more of the same, scrubbing the kitchen floor with sand and water until your hands are raw and cracked, polishing the brass door handles until you can see your own tired reflection in them, a face that looks older than your years, with shadows under the eyes and a permanent crease between the brows from squinting in dim light. You mend a torn tablecloth with stitches so small and precise that the tear becomes invisible. You press the family's clothes with a heavy flat iron heated on the stove, careful not to scorch the delicate fabrics that cost more per yard than you earn in a month. The iron is brutal on your wrists. It weighs several pounds and must be reheated constantly each trip to the stove, and back, a small journey of heat and weight and concentration. Through all of this, you're expected to be quiet, calm, pleasant if spoken to, invisible if not. You're expected to appear clean and neat despite the nature of your work, which is a small miracle of daily performance. Your cap must be straight. Your apron must be white, or as close to white as vigorous scrubbing can achieve. You must not smell of sweat, though you have been sweating since 5 a.m. You must not look tired, though your legs have not stopped moving for hours. You're in every sense performing a role within a role, a working woman, pretending that work does not touch her. The pay for all this, a general maid in a middle-class household might earn between £8 and £14 a year. That's roughly a few shillings per week. You receive room and board, which is how the arrangement is justified. They feed you, they house you, and in exchange you give them your entire waking life. Your room is in the attic usually. A small, cold, low-ceilinged space with a narrow bed, a washstand and a candle. The wind rattles the roof tiles above you at night, and in winter, the water in your washstand sometimes freezes solid before morning. But it is a room. It is a roof. And in a city where women sleep in doorways and under bridges, that matters more than comfort ever could. You remind yourself of this as the afternoon light begins to fade, and the second half of your day stretches out, before you like a road with no visible end. There is dinner to prepare, silver to lay more fires to tend. The house never stops needing you, and so you never stop moving. The steam rises around you like a veil, thick and damp and faintly caustic, and for a moment you can barely see the woman standing on the other side of the washtub. She's there, though. You can hear her grunting softly with each push and pull of fabric through the scalding water. This is laundry day. And if you have never experienced Victorian laundry day, let me assure you it was not a chore. It was a trial. It was an endurance event that lasted from before sunrise until well after dark, and it left women physically broken in ways that modern medicine would classify as occupational injury. But in the 1850s, there was no such classification. There was just Monday. Because Monday almost universally was wash day. You've been preparing since yesterday. Sunday evening, after the household had settled, you sorted the linens and clothes into piles, whites-coloured, delicates, heavily soiled. The heavily soiled items were set to soak overnight in cold water, with a handful of soda crystite to begin loosening the grime. This morning you were up at 4 before anyone else in the house stirred, because the copper needed to be filled and heated. The copper is a large metal basin built into a brick surround with a fire underneath, and filling it means hauling water. Bucket after bucket after bucket carried from the pump in the yard, or worse, from a shared standpipe, down the street, up the steps, across the kitchen and poured into the basin. Each bucket weighs roughly 25 pounds. You will carry dozens of them today. By the time the copper is full and the fire beneath it is burning steadily, your arms are already trembling and the day has barely started. Here is a mainstream historical fact that puts this in perspective. Before the widespread availability of piped water in the latter half of the 19th century, the average working-class household used approximately 50 gallons of water on wash day. That's over 400 pounds of water carried by hand, usually by women. Some historians estimate that a woman doing laundry walked the equivalent of several miles, just moving back and forth between the water source and the wash tub, and that was before the actual washing began. The soap you use is not the gentle lavender-scented bar you might picture. It's a hard yellowish block of lye soap made from animal fat and caustic soda, and it strips the oils from your skin as efficiently as it strips the dirt from linen. Within an hour, your hands are red. Within 2 hours, they are cracked. By the end of the day, they will be raw and bleeding in places, the skin split along the knuckles like dry earth after a long drought. Some women developed a condition so common it had its own name, washerwoman's hands, characterized by chronic cracking, swelling and infection that never fully healed because the following Monday would arrive and the whole process would begin again. You plunge your arms into the hot water. The heat is shocking at first, almost unbearable, and then your skin adjusts, or rather it goes slightly numb, which is the body's way of saying it has given up protesting. You scrub each garment against a ribbed washboard, working the fabric up and down in a rhythmic motion that engages your shoulders, your back, your forearms and your wrists in a continuous loop of exertion. The washboard is unforgiving. Miss your rhythm and your knuckles scrape against the ridges, leaving them bruised and tender. The sound fills the room, the wet repetitive rasping of cloth against ridged wood, punctuated by the splash of water and the occasional hiss of steam from the copper. Now here's a curious detail that often surprises people. The Victorians were genuinely obsessed with white linen. Sheets, tablecloths, shirts, undergarments. Whiteness was a marker of respectability, of cleanliness, of moral standing. A yellowed sheet was not just an aesthetic failure, it was a social one. And so women used an arsenal of techniques to achieve and maintain that whiteness. Lye was the baseline, but for stubborn stains there was also bluing a small block of synthetic ultramarine dissolved in water that counteracted the natural yellowing of white fabric. Some women used stale urine as a bleaching agent, a practice that dates back centuries and was still quietly common among the poorest laundresses. Others spread their white linens on the grass to bleach in the sun, though in a London where sunlight was filtered through a permanent haze of coal smoke, this was often an exercise in optimism rather than chemistry. The wringing is perhaps the worst part. Once washed, each item must be wrung out by hand, twisted and squeezed until as much water as possible has been forced from the fabric. For sheets and heavy wool blankets, this requires 2 people each gripping an end and twisting in opposite directions, until their arms shake and their faces flush with the effort. The strain on your wrists and shoulders is enormous. Repetitive wringing was a leading cause of chronic joint pain among Victorian working women, and many laundresses developed permanent curvature of the spine from years of bending over wash tubs. Historians still debate the average life expectancy of professional laundresses, but some research suggests it was significantly lower than that of women in other forms of manual labour. The combination of constant damp chemical exposure and physical strain took a measurable toll. You hang the clothes to dry wherever space allows. In good weather there might be a line in the yard and you carry heavy baskets of wet linen outside, pegging each item with wooden clips, while the wind tugs at the fabric and tries to undo your work. In bad weather and in London, bad weather is the default setting. You drape everything over wooden racks near the fire, turning the kitchen or scullery into a humid cloth-draped cave that smells of wet wool and soap. The damp gets into everything. It settles on the walls, the ceiling, your skin. Your clothes are damp, your hair is damp. The air itself feels like something you could wring out if you tried hard enough. And you're not just washing for your own household. Many poor women took in laundry as their primary source of income washing, for wealthier families who could afford to send their linens out. A professional washerwoman might handle the laundry of 3 or 4 households in a single week, working from a cramped back room or a shared wash house with other women. The pay was meagre, a few shillings per week depending on the volume and the client. But it was one of the few forms of employment available to married women with children because it could be done at home or at least near home while keeping one eye on the little ones. The children, of course, were often drafted into service as well. A girl of 7 or 8 might spend her day feeding the fire under the copper, fetching water, or hanging smaller items on the drying rack. Child labour wasn't a scandal in these households. It was survival. Remember that damp bone-settling cold from the room where you woke this morning. It follows you here too into the wash-house, where it mingles with the steam and creates a strange, contradictory atmosphere, hot and cold at once. Your face flushed with heat from the copper while your feet are numb on the wet stone floor. Your back aches. It has been aching for hours, that low persistent throb just above your hips that comes from bending, always, bending over the tub, over the washboard, over the wringer, over the basket. You straighten up and press your fist into the small of your back, arching slightly, and for a moment the relief is exquisite. Then you bend again. There is still so much to do. The ironing comes last after the clothes have dried, or mostly dried, because some items are deliberately left slightly damp to make the pressing easier. The iron is a flat, heavy wedge of cast metal heated on the stove until it's almost too hot to handle. You test it with a licked finger, a quick practiced tap that tells you whether it's ready. Too cool and it won't smooth the wrinkles. Too hot and you'll scorch the fabric, which means ruin, which means replacement, which means money you don't have. The hiss of hot iron meeting damp cloth is a sound you know, as intimately as your own breathing. Back and forth, pressing and lifting the weight of the iron, pulling at your wrist with each stroke. Your forearm burns with a deep muscular fatigue that no amount of rest will fully ease. By evening the laundry is done. The kitchen is draped with drying linens like the sails of some strange landlocked ship. You sit down, truly, sit down for the first time in 14 hours, and the relief of taking weight off your feet is so profound it almost makes you dizzy. Your hands are swollen. Your shoulders feel like they've been pulled apart and reassembled incorrectly. The skin on your palms is tight and hot and faintly stinging from the lye. But the linen is clean. The whites are white. And on Monday the whole magnificent, terrible process will begin again. There is a strange kind of dignity in that repetition. A rhythm that asks nothing of you except endurance. And endurance you are learning is a kind of strength that no one writes ballads about, but everyone depends upon. Your stomach growls. It's a low familiar sound so constant that it has become part of your body's background music, like the creak of your knees or the faint wheeze in your chest on cold mornings. Hunger in Victorian London wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the sharp, urgent pang you feel when you skip lunch on a busy day. It was quieter than that. Duller. A slow, persistent emptiness that sat behind your ribs like a stone you'd swallowed and couldn't quite digest. You didn't starve all at once. You starved in increments, meal by meal, penny by penny, and the skill really was learning to stretch almost nothing into just barely enough. You stand at the small table in your room, and before you is the sum total of what you have to feed your family today. A loaf of bread, not the crusty golden artisan loaf you might imagine, but a dense, heavy thing, slightly grey in colour, made from cheap flour that has almost certainly been adulterated. And here is a mainstream historical fact that should make you look at your next sandwich differently. Bread adulteration was rampant in Victorian England. Bakers, particularly those serving the poorest neighbourhoods, routinely bulked out their flour with cheaper substances. Alum was the most common additive used to whiten cheap flour and give it a more appealing texture. But investigators also found chalk bone ash plaster of Paris and, in some truly horrifying cases, ground stone. You ate it anyway. You had no choice. Bread was the foundation of the working-class diet, accounting for as much as 70% of caloric intake in the poorest households. It was cheap, it was filling, and it was available from the baker down the street who would sometimes extend a line of credit when your purse was empty and payday was still 3 days away. Beside the bread sits a small pot of dripping. Dripping was the rendered fat collected from roasted meat, beef dripping being the most common, and it was spread on bread the way you might spread butter. Except dripping was cheaper than butter, and for many poor families it was the primary source of dietary fat. The taste is rich and faintly meaty with a waxy texture that coats the roof of your mouth. It's not unpleasant, actually. Spread thickly on a slice of bread with a pinch of salt, it's warming and substantial, in a way that briefly quiets the growling in your belly. The children eat it without complaint. They've never known anything different, and to them bread and dripping is simply what food tastes like. Now, here's a curious detail that reveals just how precarious the economics of eating were. Many poor families didn't buy a whole loaf of bread at once they couldn't afford to. Instead, they bought bread by the slice, paying a halfpenny or a penny at a time. Some bakers sold yesterday's bread at a discount, and women would queue early to get the best of what was already stale. There were also bread clubs in some neighbourhoods, informal savings schemes where women pooled a few pennies each week so that one member could buy a full loaf at a better price. It was collective bargaining at its most basic and most desperate, and it speaks to the ingenuity of women who turned poverty into a kind of grim daily arithmetic. For the evening meal, if you can call it a meal, you might make a thin soup. The base is water, obviously. To this you add whatever scraps are available. A few potatoes perhaps soft and beginning to sprout but still edible if you cut away the worst parts. An onion. A handful of barley or lentils if the budget allows. A bone if you're fortunate bought from the butcher for almost nothing, already stripped of its meat by wealthier customers, but still capable of yielding a thin greasy broth if simmered long enough. You stand over the pot and stir, watching the surface shimmer with tiny circles of fat, and the smell that rises is watery and faintly savoury, more suggestion than substance. It will fill the stomach for an hour or two. It will not nourish. But it is hot, and on a cold evening in a room where the fire is struggling, hot food is a form of love. Meat was a luxury. Let that sink in for a moment. In an era when the British Empire controlled a quarter of the globe and London was arguably the wealthiest city on earth, a significant portion of its own population could not afford to eat meat more than once or twice a week, if that. When meat did appear on a poor woman's table, it was usually the cheapest cuts imaginable. Offal was common liver, kidneys, tripe, heart. These organs were nutritious, actually packed with iron and protein, but they were sold cheaply because wealthier buyers considered them beneath their dignity. Tripe, the lining of a cow's stomach, was particularly popular among the poor. It has a rubbery, slightly chewy texture, and a mild flavour that absorbs whatever you cook it with. Boiled with onions and a splash of vinegar, it made a filling, if unglamorous, supper. You ate it gratefully because the alternative was no protein at all. Historians still debate the precise nutritional status of the Victorian urban poor, and the picture is complicated. Some researchers argue that caloric intake, while low, was not as catastrophically deficient as the most dramatic accounts suggest, pointing to the availability of cheap staples like bread, potatoes, and tea. Others counter that calories alone don't tell the whole story, and that chronic deficiencies in vitamins, minerals, and protein led to widespread conditions like rickets, scurvy, anemia, and stunted growth. The children you see in the streets of Bethnal Green and Whitechapel are often small for their age, with bowed legs and pale, hollow faces. They are not starving in the way that makes newspaper headlines. They are malnourished in the slow, quiet way that shortens lives without anyone noticing the exact moment it begins. Tea remains your constant companion through all of this. Remember that weak reused cup from this morning. You will drink several more throughout the day. Tea was the universal beverage of the Victorian poor, cheap, warming and safe. The sugar you add to it, a small precious quantity, provides a quick burst of energy that keeps you moving when your body wants to stop. Some social reformers criticise the poor for spending money on tea and sugar instead of more nutritious foods, which is the kind of advice that sounds perfectly logical if you've never been cold, exhausted, and desperate for something warm and sweet to remind you that pleasure still exists. The poor were not stupid. They were making rational choices within irrational constraints, and a cup of sweet tea at the end of a 14-hour workday was not indulgence. It was medicine for the soul. There's a particular moment in the evening that you've come to both dread and cherish. The children have eaten, the pot is empty, scraped clean with a crust of bread, and now comes the quiet calculation that every poor mother knows intimately: did everyone get enough? You watched them eat. You counted the spoonfuls. You made sure the youngest got the thickest portion, the part with the most potato, the most substance, and you ate what was left, which tonight is a thin layer of broth at the bottom of the pot, and a heel of bread so hard you have to dunk it to make it chewable. Your stomach tightens around this offering and finds it wanting, but you tell yourself what you always tell yourself: the children ate. That's enough. That has to be enough. This quiet maternal sacrifice was so common it was practically invisible. Women ate last. Women ate least. It was not discussed or celebrated or even acknowledged most of the time. It was simply the way things were. The food went to the children first, then to the husband if there was one, and whatever remained went to the woman who had cooked it, carried it, stretched it, and served it. Some nutritional studies from the period suggest that working-class mothers were consistently the most undernourished members of their own households, not because food was distributed cruelly, but because love has a way of making you push your own plate towards smaller hands without even thinking about it. You rinse the pot with a splash of water and drink that too. Nothing is wasted. Nothing can be. Outside, the evening is settling over the rooftops like a heavy grey blanket, and somewhere down the street the smell of fried fish drifts from a shop window, sharp, salty, impossibly tempting. You breathe it in. It's the closest you'll get to a feast tonight. The factory bell rings at 6 a.m, and it sounds nothing like a bell should sound. It's a flat metallic clang, joyless mechanical, stripped of any musicality, and it cuts through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through damp cloth. You hear it from 3 streets away, and your body responds before your mind as your feet already moving, your shawl already pulled tight. Because lateness is not measured in minutes here. Lateness is measured in lost wages, in fines, deducted from pay that is already so thin it barely qualifies as compensation. You walk quickly through streets that are just beginning to fill with other women, other girls, all moving in the same direction, all wearing the same expression, a kind of blank forward-facing determination that conserves energy by refusing to feel anything before the shift begins. You're heading to the match factory, and if there is a single image that captures the brutal intersection of industrial profit and female suffering in Victorian England, it is this rows of women and girls, some as young as 13, sitting at long wooden benches, dipping matchsticks into phosphorus paste for 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week for wages that average between 4 and 8 shillings. The factory floor is warm at least, which is more than your tenement room can offer, but the warmth comes at a price that your body will pay over months and years in ways you cannot yet imagine. The smell hits you as you enter. It's sharp and chemical, faintly garlicky with an undertone of something sulphurous that catches in the back of your throat. That smell is white phosphorus, the key ingredient in the match heads you are producing, and it is, to put it plainly, a poison. You don't know this yet, not fully. You know that some of the older women have bad teeth, that their jaws seem swollen, that one woman on the far bench has been absent for weeks and no one talks about why. But the connection between the paste on your fingers and the decay in their bones hasn't been explained to you because explaining it would be bad for business. Here is the mainstream historical fact, and it is not a comfortable one. White phosphorus exposure caused a condition known as phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, colloquially and horrifyingly called phossy jaw. The phosphorus vapours inhaled daily over months and years attacked the bone tissue of the jaw. It began with toothaches. Then the gums swelled. Then the jawbone itself began to decay, literally rotting inside the face while the sufferer was still alive. In advanced cases, the bone glowed, a faint greenish white, in the dark, a grotesque, almost supernatural symptom that would be poetic if it weren't so devastating. The jaw would eventually have to be surgically removed, often without adequate anaesthesia, leaving women disfigured and unable to eat solid food for the rest of their shortened lives. And yet the factories continued using white phosphorus for decades because it was cheaper than the safer red phosphorus alternative, and the women who suffered were poor enough to be considered expendable. You sit at your bench. The work is repetitive and requires a specific kind of attention, not creative thought, not problem solving, just a narrow mechanical focus that numbs the mind while keeping the hands precise. You take a thin wooden splint from the pile on your left. You dip the tip into the phosphorus paste. You place it in the drying frame on your right. You take another splint. Dip. Place. Take. Dip. Place. The rhythm becomes automatic within minutes, and your hands develop a muscle memory that will outlast your conscious awareness of the task. Some women reportedly fell into a kind of waking trance during their shifts, their bodies performing the work while their minds drifted elsewhere to their children, to their suppers, to the memory of a field they once played in before the city swallowed them whole. Now here's a curious detail that historians find particularly telling. The match girls, as they were commonly called, were frequently fined for minor infractions that seem almost absurdly petty by modern standards. Talking during work hours could cost you a portion of your wages. Having dirty feet in a factory filled with chemical paste was a finable offence. Going to the toilet without permission resulted in deductions. Some women reported that their weekly pay, already meagre, was reduced by as much as half through accumulated fines. The system was designed not just to control behaviour, but to claw back wages, ensuring that the workers remained perpetually dependent, perpetually desperate, and perpetually unable to save enough money to walk away. But here is where the story shifts just slightly towards something that might almost be called hope, because the match girls did not accept this quietly forever. In the summer of 1888, the women of the Bryant and May match factory in Bow went on strike. It began with the dismissal. One of the workers was sacked reportedly for speaking to a journalist about conditions in the factory, and the response was swift and collective. Around 1,400 women and girls walked out. They had no union. They had no strike fund. They had no guarantee that they wouldn't be replaced by tomorrow morning. What they had was fury and solidarity, and the bone-deep understanding that they had nothing left to lose. The strike attracted enormous public attention. Social reformer Annie Besant had published an article titled "White Slavery in London," just weeks before detailing the conditions inside the factory, and public sympathy swung decisively toward the workers. Donations poured in, newspapers covered the story, and after just 2 weeks the company capitulated. The fines were abolished, working conditions were improved, and the match girls formed their own union, one of the first successful actions of its kind led by unskilled women workers. Historians still argue about the long-term impact of the strike. Some see it as a pivotal moment in the history of British labour, a spark, if you'll forgive the pun, that helped ignite the new unionism movement of the late 1880s. Others caution against overstating its influence, noting that conditions for most working women remained brutal for decades afterward. But whatever its broader significance, the strike proved something that polite society had preferred to ignore, that poor women were not passive, they were not grateful, and when pushed far enough they could push back. You think about this as you sit at your bench dipping splints into paste, your fingers slightly sticky, the chemical taste lingering on your lips, even though you've learned not to touch your face during your shift. The woman beside you coughs a dry, rattling cough that she tries to muffle in the crook of her elbow. She's been coughing like that for weeks. Neither of you mentions it. There is a shared, unspoken agreement on the factory floor that certain things are not discussed, because discussing them makes them real, and reality is already heavy enough without adding the weight of fear. The hours blur. The light from the high, grimy windows shifts from grey to pale yellow to grey again, as the sun makes its brief half-hearted appearance and then retreats behind the smoke. Your back stiffens. Your neck develops a crick from looking down at the bench that won't fully release until you lie down tonight, if then. The paste dries on your fingertips in a thin whitish film that you'll scrub at later with cold water and a rag, but traces of it will remain lodged in the creases of your skin under your nails, absorbed into your body in quantities too small to notice and too consistent to be harmless. The bell rings again at 8 in the evening. 14 hours. You stand and your knees protest with a cracking sound that makes the girl next to you wince in sympathy. You file out with the others, blinking in the cooler air. Your legs heavy, your mind emptied of everything except the dull animal need for food and rest. The streets are darker now. Gaslight pools on the wet cobblestones in uneven patches of amber and shadow, and you walk through them like a woman moving through water, slowly, deliberately, each step a negotiation with a body that has given everything it has. Somewhere behind you, the factory sits silent, waiting for tomorrow's bell. The phosphorus paste sits in its vats, patient and indifferent, and the splints you dip today will end up in matchboxes sold for a penny, struck once against a rough surface, and discarded a brief bright flame that no one thinks twice about. You think about flames sometimes, small ones, the kind that start with a single match, and you wonder in a quiet, tired way whether anyone will ever strike a match for you. The candle on the table is burning low, and its flame shivers with each breath of air that sneaks through the cracks in the wall. You sit close to it, close enough to feel a faint warmth on your cheek, close enough that the light falls directly onto the fabric in your lap. Your needle moves in and out, a tiny silver flash in the dim glow, trailing a thread so fine you can barely see it against the dark cotton. This is piecework. This is the other factory, the invisible one, the one that doesn't have walls or bells or supervisors standing over your shoulder. This factory is your own kitchen table, your own cramped room, your own aching hands working by candlelight long after the rest of the city has gone to sleep. The garment industry in Victorian London operated on a system that reformers called sweated labour, and the name was grimly accurate. The basic mechanism was simple and devastatingly efficient. A manufacturer would cut fabric into pieces at a central warehouse, then distribute those pieces to middlemen known as sweaters, who would in turn distribute them to women working from home. These women would sew the pieces into finished garments, shirts, trousers, waistcoats, dresses, and return them for payment. The payment was calculated per piece, and the rates were so low that a woman had to work extraordinary hours just to earn enough to survive. A shirt that sold in a West End shop for several shillings might earn the woman who sewed it a penny, sometimes less. You are sewing shirts tonight. Each one requires precise stitching along the seams, the collar, the cuffs, and the buttonholes. The buttonholes are the worst small tight, demanding a level of fine motor control that becomes increasingly difficult as the hours pass and your fingers stiffen with fatigue. You've been at this since early afternoon, and you will continue until midnight or later, and in the morning you will bundle the finished shirts into a cloth bag and carry them to the middleman's workshop across the river, where he will inspect each one with a critical eye, reject any that don't meet his standards, which means no payment for those, and hand you another bundle of cut fabric for tomorrow's work. Here is a fact that illustrates the scale of this invisible economy. By the 1880s, an estimated 125,000 women in London alone were engaged in some form of home-based needlework for the garment trade. That's a number larger than the population of many English towns, and yet these women were almost entirely invisible in official labour statistics. They didn't work in factories, so factory regulations didn't apply to them. They didn't have employers in the traditional sense, so employment protections, what few existed, didn't cover them. They existed in a grey zone between formal and informal labour, exploited by a system that profited from their invisibility. The light flickers. You pause and adjust the candle, tilting it slightly, so the melted wax pools evenly, and the wick burns straighter. Candles cost money, a halfpenny or a penny each, and you use them carefully, burning each one down to the last possible stub before replacing it. Some women used tallow candles, which were cheaper, but produced a greasy, unpleasant smoke, and a smell like burning fat that clung to everything in the room. Others used rushlights, thin reeds dipped in animal grease, which gave a dim, sputtering illumination that was barely adequate for detailed needlework. The toll on your eyesight was enormous. Seamstresses working by candlelight routinely developed severe eye-strain headaches and eventually partial or complete blindness. It was such a well-known occupational hazard that the phrase "going blind from needlework" was a common expression among working-class women, spoken with the resigned matter-of-factness of people describing weather. Now here's a curious detail that shows just how little value was placed on this labour. Some middlemen didn't pay in cash at all. Instead, they operated on a truck system, paying seamstresses in goods, typically tea sugar or fabric, at prices inflated well above market rate. A woman might sew for 12 hours and receive in return a packet of tea worth less than what she could have bought with even the meagre cash wage she was owed. The practice was technically illegal under the Truck Acts, but enforcement was nearly non-existent in the needlework trade because the women affected had neither the time, the money, nor the knowledge to pursue legal complaints. The system relied on their powerlessness, and it was remarkably effective at maintaining it. Your fingers are cramping now. You set the needle down for a moment and flex your hands, opening and closing them slowly, feeling the joints pop and the tendons stretch. Your right hand, your sewing hand, has developed a permanent curve to its fingers, a subtle but visible contortion from years of gripping a needle in the same position for hours on end. The pad of your index finger is calloused so thickly that you can push a needle through fabric without feeling the point. This is your body adapting to its work, reshaping itself around the demands placed upon it, and there is something both admirable and deeply sad about that adaptation. Your hands have become tools, efficient, specialized, and slowly wearing out. Historians still debate whether sweated labor constituted a distinct form of economic exploitation, or whether it was simply the low end of a broad spectrum of Victorian working conditions. Some argue that the piecework system, for all its cruelty, offered women a degree of flexibility that factory work did not, the ability to work from home, to set their own hours, to care for children between tasks. Others counter that this flexibility was illusory, since the rates were so low that women had no choice but to work every available hour, effectively chaining them to their tables as surely as any factory bell. The debate is worth noting because it echoes arguments still being made today about gig work, freelancing, and the difference between genuine autonomy and the mere appearance of it. Remember the match girls on the factory floor dipping splints into phosphorus paste with mechanical precision. The seamstress at her table performs a similar dance, repetitive, rhythmic numbing but in isolation rather than company. There is no one beside you to share a glance, with no one to whisper to during a lull, no foreman to resent collectively. The loneliness of home-based piecework was one of its most corrosive features. You sit alone in a small room, often with only the sound of your own breathing, and the faint tick of the needle passing through cloth for hours that stretch and blur until the candle gutters and the darkness tells you it's time to stop. Some women sang while they worked low half-remembered songs from childhood, not for pleasure, but to fill the silence with something human. You pick up the needle again. The shirt in your lap is nearly finished, one more seam, along the side, then the buttonholes, and this one can go onto the pile. You have completed 6 today, at a penny each. That is 6pence enough to buy a loaf of bread and a small measure of tea with perhaps a farthing left over. Tomorrow you will try for 7. You always try for 7. Sometimes you manage it and the extra penny feels like a small victory, a coin-sized triumph against a system that expects you to fail quietly. The candle burns lower still. The shadows in the room grow longer, creeping across the walls like slow, dark water. Your eyes are beginning to blur at the edges, the stitches swimming slightly in your vision, and you blink hard to bring them back into focus. You will finish this shirt. You will place it on the pile. You will blow out the candle and lie down on the narrow bed where the mattress remembers the shape of your exhaustion, and for a few hours the needle will stop, the thread will rest, and your hands will uncurl in the darkness like flowers that have been clenched too long. But not yet. One more seam, one more buttonhole. The needle moves in and out, catching the last of the light, steady and small and relentless. Your body knows before your mind does. There's a heaviness in your lower back that wasn't there last month, a tenderness across your chest that makes even the rough fabric of your chemise feel abrasive, and a rolling nausea that rises each morning like a tide you cannot hold back. You are pregnant, and in the slums of Victorian London, pregnancy is not a celebration. It is not an announcement tied with ribbons or whispered with joy over afternoon tea. It is a calculation. Another mouth, another body in a room already too full. Another reason to stretch the bread thinner, to work longer, to sleep less. You press your hand against your belly, still flat, still secret, and you do the arithmetic of survival in your head, and the numbers do not add up. You will not stop working. That is not a choice available to you. The rent does not pause for pregnancy. The hunger does not politely wait, and so you continue scrubbing, hauling, sewing, carrying with a life growing inside you that makes every task incrementally harder as the weeks pass. Your centre of gravity shifts, your ankles swell, the nausea fades, eventually replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that wraps around you like a second skin and never fully lifts. You stand at the wash tub, remember. That wash tub, the scalding water, the lye soap cracking your hands, and you scrub with the same rhythm as before, but now the bending sends sharp jolts of pain through your lower back that make you catch your breath and grip the edge of the basin until your knuckles whiten. Here is a mainstream historical fact that reveals the scope of what poor women faced. Maternal mortality in Victorian England was staggeringly high, particularly among the working class. Estimates suggest that for every 1,000 births, between 4 and 10 women died, and in the poorest districts of London the figure could be significantly higher. The leading causes were hemorrhage infection, often called puerperal fever, or childbed fever, and obstructed labour. These were not mysterious, untreatable conditions. They were consequences of poverty, exhaustion, malnutrition, and lack of access to even basic medical care. A wealthy woman gave birth in a clean bedroom with a trained physician in attendance. A poor woman gave birth in the same room where she cooked, slept and worked, attended by a neighbour or a local midwife, whose qualifications range from genuinely skilled to dangerously incompetent. The midwife question is one that historians still argue about with considerable energy. Some researchers emphasise that many working-class midwives were experienced, knowledgeable women who delivered hundreds of babies and possessed practical skills that rivaled those of formally trained doctors, Others point to the complete lack of regulation before the Midwives Act of 1902, which meant that literally anyone could call themselves a midwife and charge for their services, regardless of training or competence. The truth, as you might expect by now, is that both excellent and terrible midwives existed often in the same neighbourhood, and the woman in labour had limited ability to distinguish between them, particularly when labour began at 2 in the morning, and the only midwife available was the one who lived closest. Now here's a curious detail that often catches people off guard. Many poor Victorian women continued working not just through pregnancy, but on the very day of delivery. There are documented cases of women in factories and laundries who laboured in both senses of the word until contractions made it physically impossible to continue, gave birth in a back room or even on the factory floor, and returned to work within days, sometimes hours. This was not toughness performed for admiration. This was economic necessity so absolute that it overrode every instinct of the body to rest, to recover, to bond with the new life that had just emerged from you in a storm of pain and blood and animal effort. You went back to the bench because the alternative was eviction. You went back to the wash tub because the alternative was starvation. Your body screamed at you to stop and you couldn't afford to listen. The birth itself is something you try not to think about too far in advance, because thinking about it invites a fear that is large and dark and unhelpful. When the time comes, it comes with a force that is beyond your control, contractions that grip your entire body and squeeze with an intensity that makes the world narrow to a single point of sensation. The room is small and dim. A neighbour woman is with you, someone who has done this before, whose hands are rough but steady, who speaks to you in low, calm tones that you cling to like a rope in deep water. The pain is extraordinary. It comes in waves, each one larger than the last, and between them you breathe in short, shallow gasps and taste the salt of your own sweat on your lips. There is no chloroform for you. Queen Victoria famously used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child in 1853, and the practice gradually gained acceptance among the upper and middle classes. But for poor women, pain relief during labour was essentially non-existent. You gripped whatever was available, a bedpost, a knotted cloth, the hand of the woman beside you, and you endured. Some midwives offered a sip of gin or a spoonful of laudanum to take the edge off, but these were crude measures at best, and they carried their own risks. The overwhelming reality was that childbirth for poor Victorian women was an unmedicated, unmonitored ordeal conducted in unsanitary conditions, and the outcome was uncertain until the very last moment. The baby arrives. Small, slippery, impossibly fragile, with a cry that fills the tiny room and pushes against the walls as if demanding more space than this life is prepared to offer. You hold the child against your chest skin to skin heartbeat, to heartbeat, and for a moment, just a moment, the arithmetic of survival falls silent. The rent doesn't matter. The bread doesn't matter. The wash tub, the factory bell, the pile of unfinished shirts, none of it matters. There is only this warmth, this weight, this impossibly small collection of fingers and toes and breath. But the moment passes. It has to. Because the world outside this room has not paused, and the clock on the mantelpiece, if you own a clock, which you probably don't, continues its indifferent ticking. Within days you will be back on your feet. Your body will ache in new and unfamiliar ways. Your breasts will be swollen and sore, and you will nurse the baby while simultaneously kneading bread dough or folding laundry, learning the particular choreography of motherhood and manual labour performed in tandem. The baby will sleep in a drawer, literally a wooden drawer pulled from a chest and lined with rags, because a cradle is a luxury item, and drawers are free. And here is something worth sitting with for a moment. A thought that carries weight beyond the historical record. These women, your great-great-grandmothers perhaps, gave birth in rooms smaller than your bathroom. They nursed their children while their own stomachs growled with hunger. They went back to work before their bodies had healed, not because they were heroes in any storybook sense, but because the machinery of poverty does not have a pause button and never has. They did these things not with grand declarations of strength, but with the quiet, unwitnessed stubbornness of people who simply refused to stop breathing when everything around them suggested they should. The baby stirs against your chest, a small sound, not quite a cry, more a murmur, a negotiation with consciousness. You adjust the blanket around those tiny shoulders, and feel the warmth of new life pressing against the rhythm of your own tired heart. Outside, the city rumbles on, the factories hum, the carts rattle, and somewhere in a grand house across the river, a woman rings a bell for her maid and wonders aloud why the nursery fire hasn't been lit. You hold your baby tighter. The fire in your room is barely an ember. But the warmth between you is enough. For now, it is enough. The door is heavy. Heavier than a door should be, or perhaps it only feels that way because of what it represents. You stand before it with your bundle of belongings, a spare dress, a comb with missing teeth, a handkerchief that belonged to your mother, and you look up at the building that will swallow you whole. The stone is grey and featureless, the windows small and high and barred, and above the entrance carved into the lintel, with the kind of permanence that suggests no apology will ever be offered, are the words you've been dreading for months. This is the workhouse, and you are here because there is nowhere else left to go. The workhouse was Victorian England's answer to the question of what to do with people who could no longer support themselves. It was not designed to be comfortable. It was not designed to be kind. It was designed with meticulous and deliberate cruelty to be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek its shelter. This was not an accident or an oversight, it was policy. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 explicitly stated that conditions inside the workhouse should be worse than the worst conditions available outside it, a principle known as less eligibility. The reasoning was breathtakingly cold. If the workhouse was comfortable, the thinking went, the poor would flock to it and stop working. Therefore it must be made miserable enough to serve as a deterrent. The poor must be punished for their poverty, lest poverty become attractive. You step inside. The smell is institutional carbolic soap, boiled cabbage, and something underneath both that speaks of too many bodies in too little space with too little ventilation. A clerk sits behind a desk and takes your details with the bored efficiency of a man who has processed 1,000 broken lives and expects to process 1,000 more. Your name, your age, your parish, your reason for applying. You answer each question and feel yourself shrinking, with every response becoming less a person and more a number, a case of problem to be administered. And then comes the part that poor women feared above almost anything else, the separation. If you have entered the workhouse with your family, you will not remain together. Men, women and children were housed in separate wards. Husbands were separated from wives. Mothers were separated from children. This was not a logistical necessity, it was intentional. The architects of the workhouse system believed that family separation would discourage people from seeking relief and would impose a kind of moral discipline on the poor. In practice, it meant that a mother who had fought to keep her children fed, who had sold her furniture and pawned her wedding ring, and eaten nothing herself so that her little ones could have bread, was now told that her children would sleep in a different building, and she would see them for 1 supervised hour per week. The cruelty was systematic and administrative, delivered not with a raised hand, but with a policy document and a clerk's stamp. Here's a curious detail that captures the dehumanizing efficiency of the system. Upon admission, you were stripped of your own clothes and issued a workhouse uniform, a shapeless grey dress made of coarse fabric, identical to every other woman's dress in the building. Your own clothes were stored fumigated and returned to you only upon discharge. The uniform served a dual purpose. Practically, it simplified laundry and reduced the spread of lice. Symbolically, it erased your identity. You were no longer Mary or Jane or Elizabeth. You were an inmate, a pauper, a category rather than a person. Some women later described the moment they put on the workhouse dress as the point at which they felt they had truly lost everything. Not when they lost their homes or their savings, but when they lost their clothes. Because your clothes, however worn and patched and threadbare, were yours. They carried your shape, your smell, your history. The workhouse dress carried nothing but shame. The daily routine was rigid and unvarying. You rose at 6. You prayed attendance at chapel was mandatory because the Victorians believed that poverty was at least partly a moral failing that could be corrected through religious instruction. You ate breakfast, typically a bowl of gruel or porridge so thin and flavourless that the word food feels generous. Then you worked. Women in the workhouse were assigned tasks deemed appropriate to their sex picking. Oakum was perhaps the most notorious. Oakum picking involved unravelling old tarred ropes into loose fibres, which were then used for caulking ships. The tar stained your fingers black, and the coarse fibres tore at your skin until your hands bled. You sat in a large room with dozens of other women all picking in silence, the only sound the dry rasping whisper of rope being pulled apart strand by strand. It was monotonous, painful, and utterly without dignity, which was precisely the point. Historians still debate the overall impact and legacy of the workhouse system with considerable passion. Some argue that for all its harshness, the workhouse did provide a genuine safety net, a last resort that prevented outright starvation and death on the streets. They point to the fact that workhouses provided food, shelter, and basic medical care to people who would otherwise have had none, and that the system, however imperfect, saved lives. Others counter that the psychological damage inflicted by the workhouse, the shame, the dehumanization, the family separation was so severe that it constituted a form of institutional abuse, and that the system functioned less as a safety net and more as a tool of social control designed to discipline the poor into accepting whatever conditions the labour market offered, no matter how exploitative. The workhouse cast a shadow that lasted generations. Well into the 20th century, elderly people who had spent time in the workhouse as children carried a deep visceral shame about it, often refusing to speak of the experience even to their own families. The food deserves its own mention because it was so famously terrible that it became a cultural touchstone. Charles Dickens, of course, immortalised the workhouse diet with Oliver Twist's famous request for more gruel, and while Dickens was writing fiction, he was drawing on well-documented reality. Meals in the workhouse were calculated to provide the minimum caloric intake necessary to sustain life and labour, and not a calorie more. Breakfast was gruel or porridge. Dinner, the main meal, was typically boiled meat and potatoes twice a week, with soup or bread and cheese on the other days. Supper was bread and tea, the portions were small, the quality was poor, the variety was non-existent. You ate the same meals on the same days, in the same room, at the same table, week after week, until the very concept of food as pleasure, as something to be savoured, anticipated, enjoyed, was slowly ground out of you, like colour fading from fabric left too long in the sun. Remember that drawer where your baby slept back in the tenement room, that now feels almost cosy by comparison. Remember the thin broth, with its shimmer of fat, the bread and dripping, that at least tasted of something real. In the workhouse, even those small worn comforts are gone, replaced by routine and regulation, and the particular silence of people who have stopped expecting anything good to happen. But you endure. You pick the oakum until your fingers bleed, and then you pick it some more. You eat the gruel, and you do not ask for more because you have read Dickens or at least heard the story, and you know what happens to those who want more than they are given. You lie in your narrow cot at night in a long ward of identical cots occupied by identical grey-dressed women, and you stare at the ceiling, and you think about your children sleeping somewhere in this same building, breathing the same carbolic air, and you cannot reach them. The hardest part is not the hunger. It is not the work. It is not the uniform or the silence or the mandatory prayers. The hardest part is the door, that heavy door you walked through this morning, because you know everyone knows that walking out again requires proving you can support yourself, and proving that requires a job, and finding a job requires an address that isn't the workhouse, and the world outside has a long and unforgiving memory for women who have worn the grey dress. You close your eyes. The cot is hard beneath your back. The wool blanket scratches against your chin. Somewhere down the ward a woman is crying quietly, trying to muffle the sound in her pillow, and you listen to it the way you listen to rain, not with sympathy exactly, but with recognition. You have made that sound yourself. Tomorrow the bell will ring at 6. You will rise. You will pray. You will eat gruel that tastes of nothing. And you will pick oakum until your fingers remember what it means to bleed. But tonight, in this narrow space between one day and the next, you allow yourself to think of the tenement room, the cracked window, the smell of weak tea, the weight of your baby against your chest, and the warmth, thin, fragile, barely enough that made it feel for just a moment like home. You leave the workhouse behind, not because the story demands a neat escape, but because your mind wanders now to the women who never entered it at all, the ones who found other ways, stranger ways, the women who made their living in the cracks and margins of Victorian society doing jobs that polite company refused to name, and respectable history preferred to forget. These were the invisible trades, the work that kept poor women alive when every conventional door had closed. You're standing in a small dim room at the back of a terraced house in Suffolk. The air is thick with a smell you cannot immediately identify, something sweet and heavy floral, but wrong, like perfume poured over something rotting. There is a table in the centre of the room, and on that table, covered with a white sheet, lies a body. A woman. She died yesterday, typhus perhaps, or cholera, or simple exhaustion dressed up as something medical. And you are here to wash her, to prepare her for burial. Because this is your job. You are a layer out of the dead. It was a trade almost exclusively performed by women and almost exclusively by poor women. When someone died in a working-class household, the family called for the layer-out a neighbour, usually someone known in the community, someone whose hands were steady and whose stomach was strong. Your task was to wash the body, close the eyes and mouth, plug the nostrils with cotton, bind the jaw shut with a strip of cloth tied over the head, and dress the deceased in whatever burial garments the family could provide. You worked gently, you worked thoroughly, and you were paid a few shillings for your trouble plus, and this is a detail historians love to mention, a meal and a generous measure of gin. Here's the curious thing about this particular trade. The layer-out occupied a strange liminal space in the social hierarchy of the slums. She was needed, even essential, but she was also feared. There was a superstition widespread and persistent that women who regularly handled the dead carried a kind of spiritual contamination. Some neighbours would cross the street rather than walk past a known layer-out. Children were warned not to touch her. And yet when death came knocking, as it did with brutal regularity in the overcrowded tenements of Victorian London, the layer-out was the first person summoned. She was simultaneously untouchable and indispensable, a paradox that tells you everything about how Victorian society treated the women who did its dirtiest work. But the laying out of the dead was only one thread in a vast web of invisible female labour. Consider the mudlark, but we'll wade into those Thames waters soon enough. Consider instead the pure finder. This was a woman, or sometimes a man, but often a woman who walked the streets collecting dog excrement. I'll give you a moment with that. The excrement was sold to tanneries where it was used in the leather curing process. The substance was known in the trade as pure, a name so absurdly euphemistic that it borders on dark comedy. Pure finders roamed the streets with a bucket and a glove, scooping their product from gutters and pavements, and delivered it to the tannery for a few pence per bucket. It was degrading, it was foul, and it was a living barely for women who had no other options. Some pure finders reportedly earned between 6 and 10 shillings a week, which was comparable to what a seamstress might make sewing shirts by candlelight, but with significantly more fresh air, if you could call it that. Here is a mainstream historical fact that frames these occupations in their proper context. The journalist Henry Mayhew, in his landmark work documenting the lives of London's poor in the 1850s, catalogued dozens of street trades practiced by women: watercress sellers, flower girls, costermongers hawking bruised apples and wilting vegetables from wooden barrows, women who sold hot eels from steaming pots on street corners, women who collected and resold cigar butts, women who gathered rags, bones and scrap metal from rubbish heaps. Each of these trades existed in a precarious ecosystem of poverty, where the line between employment and destitution was so thin that a single bad week, a spell of illness, a stretch of rain that kept customers indoors could push a woman from surviving to drowning. Historians still debate how to categorize this shadow economy. Some frame it as evidence of remarkable entrepreneurial spirit, women creating income from nothing, identifying niches, building informal networks of supply and demand in conditions that would crush less resourceful people. Others argue that calling it entrepreneurship romanticizes what was essentially desperation, and that these women were not choosing to collect dog excrement or sell watercress at 4 a.m. They were doing it because every other avenue had been closed to them by a society that offered poor women almost no legitimate path to economic security. The debate matters because it shapes how we understand poverty itself as a problem of individual resourcefulness or a failure of collective structure. There's a philosophical thread worth pulling here gently as the night deepens around us. These invisible trades, the laying out, the pure finding, the rag picking, the eel selling, were performed by women whose names appear in no history books, whose faces survive in no photographs, whose stories were never considered worth recording. They moved through the city like ghosts with calloused hands, performing tasks that everyone needed and no one wanted to see. And yet without them, the machinery of daily life would have stalled. Without the layer out, the dead would go unwashed. Without the pure finder, the leather trade would falter. Without the costermonger and her barrow, entire neighbourhoods would go without fresh food. These women were the invisible infrastructure of Victorian London, and the city stood on their backs without ever looking down. You think about the woman on the table in Southwark. You have finished washing her. Her face is calm now, the tension of her last hours smoothed away by your careful hands. You have closed her eyes with pennies, old coins, cool against the lids, and bound her jaw with a clean strip of linen. She looks peaceful in a way she probably never looked in life, and there is something both beautiful and deeply unfair about that. Peace should not be a luxury reserved for the dead. You dry your hands on your apron, the gin the family offered sits warmly in your stomach, and the few shillings in your pocket feel solid and real against your thigh as you walk. The street outside is quiet. A cat watches you from a windowsill with unblinking yellow eyes. The gaslight hums faintly above, casting your shadow long and thin across the cobblestones. You have touched death today, and it has not touched you back. Not yet. And so you walk home through the London dark, your hands still smelling faintly of lavender water and carbolic soap, carrying the strange quiet dignity of a woman who does what others cannot bear to do. The gin from the laying out still hums faintly in your blood, and you understand now in a way that is difficult to put into words why that small glass was offered so readily. It wasn't payment, it wasn't hospitality, it was medicine. A brief burning erasure of the thing you just did, the cold skin beneath your fingers, the weight of a body that no longer held a person inside it. The gin softens the edges. It blurs the memory just enough to make the walk home bearable. And it is here in this small, warm, chemical mercy that we find the doorway into one of the most complicated and least sympathetically told chapters of poor Victorian women's lives. The search for numbness. You do not drink often. You cannot afford to. But when you do, it is not for pleasure in any recreational sense. It is for silence, a temporary quieting of the noise inside your head, the endless arithmetic of survival, the worry that hums beneath every waking moment like a wire pulled too tight. How will I pay the rent? What will the children eat tomorrow? Why does my chest hurt when I breathe? Is that cough getting worse? The gin answers none of these questions, but for an hour or two, it makes them feel less urgent, less sharp, less like they're carving grooves into the inside of your skull. And that hour of relief purchased for a penny at the gin shop on the corner is sometimes the only mercy available in an entire week of merciless days. Gin was the drug of the Victorian poor, and it had been for over a century. The gin craze of the 1730s and 40s had left a deep cultural scar on English society, and by the Victorian era, gin consumption among the working class was viewed not as a symptom of suffering, but as a cause of moral failure. The temperance movement, powerful, vocal, and overwhelmingly middle class, preached abstinence, with evangelical fervour framing alcohol as the root of poverty rather than its companion. Drunkards were lazy, drunkards were sinful, drunkards deserved their misery, and drunkard women, well, they were something worse. A man who drank was weak, a woman who drank was fallen. The double standard was as rigid as it was cruel, and it meant that poor women who sought even occasional relief in alcohol were judged not just as failures, but as moral abominations unfit for motherhood, unfit for sympathy, unfit for the basic human dignity of being understood. Here is a mainstream historical fact that complicates the temperance narrative considerably. Alcohol was genuinely safer to drink than water in many parts of Victorian London. The city's water supply, drawn largely from the Thames and its tributaries, was contaminated with sewage industrial waste and the runoff from slaughterhouses and tanneries. Cholera outbreaks, the great equalizer that killed rich and poor alike, though the poor died in far greater numbers, were directly linked to contaminated water. Beer and gin, whatever their other drawbacks, had the advantage of being boiled during production, which killed the bacteria that made water lethal. So when a poor woman chose gin over water, she was not necessarily making an irrational or self-destructive choice. She was making a survival calculation in an environment where the healthy option could literally kill her. But gin was not the only chemical escape available. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was sold openly over the counter at chemist shops and was astonishingly cheap. A penny could buy enough laudanum to last several days, and it was marketed not as a recreational drug but as a medicine. It treated everything: headaches, toothaches, menstrual cramps, coughs, diarrhea, insomnia, anxiety, and the vague catch-all. Victorian diagnosis of nervous complaints. Women used it freely. They gave it to their children. A few drops of laudanum in a spoonful of sugar water was a common method of quieting a fussy baby, a practice so widespread that it had its own grim nickname. They called it Mother's Helper. The baby would fall silent, its tiny body heavy with artificial sleep, and the mother could return to her sewing or her scrubbing or her endless grinding labour without the distraction of a crying child. Now here's a curious and deeply unsettling detail. Some baby-minding services women who watched other women's children for a fee while the mothers worked used laudanum routinely to keep their charges docile. The children would be dosed in the morning and left in a semi-conscious state for hours, sometimes the entire day. Deaths from accidental overdose were not uncommon, and inquests into infant deaths frequently revealed laudanum as a contributing factor. Yet prosecution was rare. The coroner's reports would note the cause of death with clinical detachment, and the cycle would continue because the underlying conditions that made laudanum necessary poverty, overwork the absence of any institutional childcare, remained unchanged. Historians still debate the extent of opium dependency among Victorian working-class women. Some researchers argue that habitual laudanum use was widespread enough to constitute a public health crisis, pointing to pharmacy records and coroner's reports as evidence. Others caution that the available data is patchy, and that middle-class observers, journalists, reformers, physicians had a tendency to exaggerate the drug habits of the poor as a way of reinforcing existing class prejudices. What is not debated is that laudanum was available, it was cheap, it was effective, and it was used by women whose lives offered very few other sources of relief. Whether that constitutes addiction or rational self-medication depends very much on where you stand and how much pain you've been asked to carry. You're sitting in your room now. The children are asleep, genuinely asleep, not dosed, just exhausted from the day's small exertions of being alive and young and hungry. The room is quiet. That particular quality of urban quiet that is never truly silent. You can hear footsteps above you, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the distant clatter of a late cart on cobblestones, the faint murmur of voices through the thin wall that separates your room from the family next door. But within these four walls there is stillness, and you sit in it the way you might sit in shallow water, not submerged but surrounded, letting it hold you without asking anything in return. Remember that cup of weak tea from the very first morning of this journey, the one you held between cracked hands in the grey pre-dawn light. 30 seconds of warmth that belonged only to you. This moment is its echo. A small pocket of peace, stolen from between the folds of a day that gave you nothing willingly. You don't have gin tonight. You don't have laudanum. You have only the quiet and the heaviness of your own body settling into the chair, and the slow realization that sometimes the absence of pain is its own kind of pleasure. Your eyes drift closed. Not fully, you are not ready for sleep yet. Not quite, but enough that the room softens around you. The edges of the furniture blurring the cracks in the ceiling, becoming less like wounds and more like the lines on an old familiar face. You breathe in. The air smells of coal smoke and damp wool and the faintest trace of the lavender water you used to wash the dead woman's face this afternoon. It is not a beautiful smell. But it is yours. This room, this air, this life, brutal and exhausting and relentless as it is yours. And for now, in this thin slice of silence between one day and the next, that is almost enough. The tide is out. You can tell before you even reach the riverbank because the smell changes, that thick, marshy, sulphurous stench that rises from the exposed mud of the Thames like the breath of something ancient and unwell. The river at low tide is not the postcard Thames of painted bridges and pleasure boats. It is a vast, glistening expanse of dark mud studded with the debris of a city that uses its river as both artery and sewer. And you are walking toward it, boots in hand, because today you are a mudlark, Mudlarking was one of the lowest rungs on Victorian London's economic ladder, and it was dominated by women, children, and the elderly people too weak, too old, or too young for factory work but too desperate to do nothing. The practice was simple in concept and miserable in execution. When the tide retreated, you waded into the exposed riverbed and searched for anything of value. Coal fragments dropped from barges, copper nails, iron bolts, rope bones, bits of metal, the occasional coin. You carried a bag or a bucket and you worked quickly because the tide waited for no one and the mud had a habit of gripping your ankles with a slow, sucking persistence that could trap you if you weren't careful. The sensation of the mud is something your body never fully accepts. It is cold, deeply penetratingly cold, and it oozes between your toes and up around your calves, with a texture that is part liquid, part solid, and entirely revolting. The surface is slick, with a film of oil and waste that catches the grey light in rainbow patterns that would almost be beautiful if you didn't know what they were made of. Beneath the surface layer, the mud is thick and clinging, and every step requires effort, a slow, deliberate pulling of each foot from the river's grip. Your legs ache within minutes. Your feet go numb within 10. Here is a mainstream historical fact that puts the mudlark's world in perspective. The Thames in the mid-19th century was essentially an open sewer. Before the construction of Joseph Bazalgette's revolutionary sewage system in the 1860s, virtually all of London's human waste flowed directly into the river. Industrial runoff from tanneries, slaughterhouses and chemical works added to the toxic cocktail. The great stink of 1858, when the smell from the river became so overpowering that Parliament itself had to suspend sessions, was not an anomaly, but a climax. This was the water that mudlarks waded through barefoot day after day, their skin in constant contact with a bacterial nightmare that would make a modern health inspector weep. You bend and pick up a lump of coal roughly the size of your fist. You brush the mud from it and drop it into your bucket with a satisfying thunk. Coal is the most reliable find. Fragments fall from the barges that transport it upriver, and a good day's mudlarking might yield enough coal to heat your room for an evening or to sell for a few pence. Copper nails are more valuable but rarer. Bones can be sold to bone grinders who process them into fertilizer or animal feed. And occasionally, very occasionally, you find something genuinely worth money. A silver spoon, a brass fitting, a piece of jewellery lost overboard by some careless passenger on a pleasure cruise who will never know that their loss became your salvation. Now here's a curious detail that historians find particularly poignant. Many mudlarks developed a kind of expertise and almost archaeological eye for reading the mud. Experienced mudlarks knew which stretches of riverbank were most productive, which tides deposited the best debris, which spots near wharves and docks were likely to yield coal or metal. They knew the mud the way a farmer knows soil, its textures, its moods, its hidden offerings. Some mudlarks worked the same stretch of bank for years, even decades, developing a territorial knowledge that was passed from mother to daughter, like an inheritance made of filth and necessity. There was skill in this work, even if no one outside the riverbank would ever recognise it as such. Historians still debate how many people relied on mudlarking as their primary income. Henry Mayhew estimated several hundred regular mudlarks working the Thames in the 1850s, but other sources suggest the number was significantly higher, particularly during economic downturns when factory work dried up, and women who might otherwise have been employed in domestic service or needlework were forced onto the riverbank as a last resort. The debate reflects a broader difficulty in documenting the lives of people who existed largely outside formal economic structures, no employment records, no tax documents, no paper trail of any kind. The mudlarks moved through the city like water through cracks, filling the spaces that no one else wanted to occupy. You straighten up. Your back protests that same low, grinding ache that follows you everywhere now, from the washtub to the sewing table to the river mud. Your bucket is half full. Coal, mostly. A few nails. A length of copper wire that will fetch a penny or two from the marine store dealer on the high street. Your feet are numb and your hands are stiff with cold, the mud drying on your skin, in a thin grey crust that tightens as it hardens. You look down at yourself, mud to the knees, skirtum soaked and heavy fingers blackened, and for a moment you see yourself as a stranger might see you, a figure from a nightmare, a woman reduced to wading through a city's waste for scraps. But you don't feel like a nightmare. You feel like a woman with half a bucket of coal, and a length of copper wire and a tide that's beginning to turn. You feel like someone who woke up this morning with nothing, and will go home tonight with something however small. The river gave it to you, reluctantly, grudgingly wrapped in filth and cold, but it gave. You climb the stone steps back to street level, your wet feet slapping against the worn surface, and the city receives you without comment. No one looks twice at a mudlark. You are as much a part of the landscape as the lampposts and the gutters, visible but unseen, present but unacknowledged. The bucket is heavy in your hand. The wind off the river bites at your damp skin. And ahead of you the long walk home stretches out like a promise made by someone who may or may not keep it. The mission hall smells of wet wool and boiled potatoes, and something that might be disinfectant but might also be despair scrubbed into the floorboards over many years. You sit on a hard wooden bench near the back, your hands folded in your lap, your head slightly bowed, not in prayer, not yet, but in the particular posture of a woman who has learned that looking too comfortable in a place like this invites questions she doesn't want to answer. Around you, other women sit in similar positions, similarly folded, similarly quiet. You are all here for the same reason. There is food, and the price of that food is a sermon. Victorian charity was not simple generosity. It was a transaction. The middle and upper classes gave money, food, clothing, shelter, and in return they expected something from the poor. Gratitude certainly. Deference absolutely. But most of all they expected moral improvement. The philosophy that underpinned most Victorian charitable work was rooted in a belief that poverty was at least in part a consequence of moral weakness, laziness, drunkenness, sexual impropriety, irreligion. Therefore, the cure for poverty was not merely material aid, but spiritual correction. Feed the body, save the soul. And if the soul proved resistant to saving well, perhaps the body didn't deserve feeding after all. The woman at the front of the hall is reading from the Bible. Her voice is clear and well-educated, her dress clean and fashionable, in a restrained evangelical sort of way. She's a philanthropist, a lady visitor, as they were sometimes called, and she has come to this corner of Whitechapel to bring the light of Christian virtue to women she genuinely believes she is helping, and perhaps she is. The potatoes are real, the bread is real, the blankets distributed at the door are thin but warm. These things matter, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the sermon is also real, and it comes with assumptions about your character that sit in your stomach alongside the potatoes like stones. Here is a mainstream historical fact that illustrates the scale and complexity of Victorian charity. By the second half of the 19th century, London had over 700 distinct charitable organisations serving the poor. 700. The sheer volume created its own problems, overlapping jurisdictions, competing philosophies, and what reformers called the charity maze, a bewildering tangle of institutions that the poor had to navigate with no map and no guide. Some charities required proof of church attendance. Others demanded evidence of deserving poverty, meaning you had to demonstrate that your destitution was caused by misfortune rather than moral failure. The distinction between deserving and undeserving poor was central to Victorian charitable thinking, and it was applied with particular harshness to women. A widow was deserving, an abandoned wife was questionable, an unmarried mother was almost certainly undeserving regardless of the circumstances that led to her condition. Now here's a curious detail that captures the uncomfortable intimacy of Victorian charity work. Many philanthropic organisations employed lady visitors who made house calls to the homes of poor women, inspecting their living conditions, questioning their habits and offering advice that ranged from genuinely helpful to breathtakingly patronising. Was the home clean enough? Were the children properly supervised? Was there evidence of alcohol? Was the woman attending church regularly? These visits were framed as compassionate outreach, but they functioned as surveillance, a system of moral monitoring that gave middle-class women access to working-class homes and the authority to judge what they found there. Some poor women welcomed the visitors, recognising them as a gateway to material aid. Others resented the intrusion deeply, but endured it in silence because the alternative was losing access to the food, the clothing, the small sums of money that kept the household afloat. Historians still debate whether Victorian philanthropy did more harm than good. Some argue that charitable organisations provided essential services that the state was unwilling or unable to deliver: medical care, education, housing assistance, emergency relief. Without charity, they contend, the suffering of the poor would have been immeasurably worse. Others counter that the charitable model, by framing poverty as a moral problem requiring individual correction rather than a structural problem requiring systemic change, actively delayed the development of the welfare state and perpetuated the very conditions it claimed to address. The debate is not merely academic, it echoes in every modern discussion about food banks, homeless shelters, and the line between helping people and controlling them. You eat the potatoes. They are floury and slightly undercooked, but they are hot, and they fill the hollow space beneath your ribs that has been aching since yesterday. The bread is yesterday's, donated from a bakery whose wealthier customers would not accept day-old loaves. You eat it without complaint. Remember that bread from earlier in our journey, the grey adulterated loaf stretched across an entire family's dinner. This bread is better, whiter. It tastes like something made for people who expect food to taste good, and the contrast is sharp enough to sting. The sermon continues. The lady at the front is speaking about temperance now, about the evils of drink, about the sacred duty of motherhood, and you listen with the polite blankness of a woman who has heard these words many times before. You do not disagree exactly. You simply exist in a different universe from the one she's describing, a universe where virtue is a luxury and survival is a full-time occupation that leaves no energy for moral self-improvement. She means well. You believe that. Her eyes are kind and her concern appears genuine. But there is a gulf between her world and yours that no amount of boiled potatoes can bridge, and you both know it even if only one of you would admit it. You leave the mission hall with a blanket under your arm, and the taste of charity potatoes still thick on your tongue. The evening air is cold against your face after the stuffy warmth of the hall, and you breathe it in deeply. Coal, smoke, damp stone, the faint sweetness of rotting vegetables from the market stalls being packed away for the night. It is not clean air, but it is free air. It comes without conditions, without sermons, without the quiet expectation that you should be grateful in a way that is visible and confirming. You pull the blanket tighter and walk home through streets that know your footsteps better than any charitable visitor ever will. The blanket from the mission hall is scratchy against your neck, but you don't mind. You're sitting on an overturned crate in the narrow yard behind your tenement, and beside you is a woman named, well, it doesn't matter what she's named. What matters is that she is laughing. A real laugh, full and sudden and slightly too loud for the hour, the kind of laugh that escapes before you can catch it and press it back down into the place where poor women are supposed to keep their joy small, quiet, and out of sight. She is your neighbour, or she lives in the room directly above yours with 4 children and a husband who works the docks when there is work and drinks when there isn't. You know the sound of her footsteps on the ceiling the way you know the rhythm of your own pulse. You know when she's cooking because the smell of onions drifts down through the cracks in the floorboards. You know when the baby is sick because the crying seeps through the walls like water. And she knows your sounds too, your coughing in the early morning, the scrape of your chair, the low murmur of your voice singing the children to sleep. You are intimate without ever having chosen each other. Proximity made you neighbours. Survival made you friends. This is the part of the story that often gets lost. The history of poor Victorian women is overwhelmingly told as a catalogue of suffering, hunger, disease, exploitation, death, and all of that is true, every word of it. But it is not the complete truth because human beings are stubborn, contrary, magnificent creatures who insist on finding moments of joy even in the most inhospitable soil, and poor women found joy. Not the grand performative joy of ballrooms and champagne, but the small, fierce, defiant kind. The kind that grows in cracks. Here is a mainstream historical fact that offers a window into those cracks. Working-class women in Victorian London developed rich social networks centred around shared spaces, the communal water pump, the wash house, the market, the pub, the doorstep. These were not merely functional encounters. They were the infrastructure of emotional survival. Women shared food when one family had less than another. They watched each other's children. They pooled knowledge about which landlords were fair, which employers were dangerous, which pawnbrokers offered the best rates. Information flowed through these networks like water through roots, invisible from above but essential to everything that grew. Your neighbour is telling you about something that happened at the market this morning, a dispute between a costermonger and a customer over the weight of a bag of apples that escalated into a shouting match so spectacular that a small crowd gathered to watch. She imitates the costermonger's voice, broad and indignant, and then the customer's shrill and outraged, and she switches between the two with a theatrical flair that would not be out of place on a music hall stage. You laugh until your ribs hurt. The sound bounces off the brick walls of the yard and disappears into the evening sky, and for a moment, just a moment, the weight lifts. Now here's a curious detail about working-class leisure that surprises people. Despite the relentless demands of their daily lives, poor Victorian women did find time for entertainment, though it looked nothing like the leisurely afternoons of their wealthier counterparts. The music hall was the great democratic entertainment of the Victorian working class, offering cheap seats and raucous performances that combined singing comedy and melodrama. Women attended when they could afford the penny admission, and the songs they heard there, sentimental ballads about lost love, comic numbers about the absurdities of daily life, became the soundtrack of the tenements hummed while scrubbing floors and whispered while rocking babies to sleep. Some historians argue that the music hall was more than entertainment. It was a communal space where working-class identity was performed, celebrated and reinforced, a place where poor women could laugh at the same jokes and cry at the same songs, and feel briefly like members of a community rather than isolated units of labour. Historians still debate the degree to which working-class women's friendships constituted a form of informal resistance. Some scholars see these networks as proto-political, the foundations upon which later organising efforts like the Match Girl strike were built. Remember those 1,400 women who walked out of the Bryant and May factory? That kind of collective action doesn't emerge from nowhere. It grows from years of shared grievance, whispered conversations, mutual trust, built one favour at a time. Others argue that reading political significance into everyday friendships is a stretch, and that women's social bonds were exactly what they appeared to be: survival strategies and sources of comfort with no grand ideological dimension. Perhaps both are true simultaneously. Your neighbour has stopped laughing now. The evening is settling around you, both soft and grey, and the yard is filling with the long shadows of drying laundry strung between the walls like tired flags. She leans her head back against the brick and sighs, not a sad sigh, but a deep releasing one, the kind that empties the lungs completely and leaves room for something lighter to fill the space. You sit together in the quiet. The sounds of the tenement surround you. A child calling for its mother, the clatter of a pot, someone singing off-key behind a closed window. The ordinary music of lives being lived in close quarters, imperfect and inescapable and strangely comforting. She offers you half a biscuit from her apron pocket. It's dry and slightly stale, probably bought from the penny bakery on the corner 3 days ago. You take it. You break your half into 2 pieces and give one back. She rolls her eyes and eats it, and neither of you comments on the exchange because this is how it works between you. Everything halved, everything shared, everything stretched just a little further because there are 2 pairs of hands pulling instead of one. The first stars appear above the rooftops, faint and tentative, as if unsure whether London's smoke will allow them to be seen. You watch them together. 2 women on an overturned crate in a yard that smells of damp brick and coal dust, sharing a stale biscuit and a silence that asks nothing of either of you. It is not much, but it is warm. And sometimes warmth is not about fire at all. The whisper reaches you the way most important things reach poor women, sideways through a neighbour, over a shared pump between the lines of ordinary conversation. Something is happening. Something is changing. Or at least something is trying to change, pushing against the enormous weight of the way things have always been with a force that is small but stubborn and refuses to be ignored. You hear it first from the woman who sells watercress on the corner near the market. She mentions a meeting, a gathering of women factory workers mostly held in the back room of a pub near Bow. They talked about wages. They talked about fines. They talked about the things that everyone knows but no one says aloud because saying them aloud makes them real. And real things demand action, and action has consequences that poor women cannot always afford. But someone said them anyway. Someone stood up in that back room and spoke the words that had been sitting in every woman's chest like a stone, and the room listened, and the listening itself was a kind of revolution. This is the slow, uneven, often invisible process of resistance that threaded through the lives of poor Victorian women like a seam that keeps threatening to show. It did not look like resistance in the way that history books typically depict it. No barricades, no manifestos, no dramatic speeches on the steps of Parliament. It looked like women talking to each other. It looked like a seamstress refusing to accept a rate cut and losing her position because of it. It looked like a laundress telling a client that the price was the price and she would not go lower. Small acts, quiet acts, acts that left no trace in the historical record except in the aggregate, where they accumulated like snowflakes into something that eventually became impossible to ignore. Here is a mainstream historical fact that anchors this slow shift. The late Victorian period saw a remarkable surge in female labour activism. The Match Girls' strike of 1888. Remember those women walking out of Bryant and May, furious and united and terrified, was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader wave. In the years that followed, women workers in industries ranging from textiles to chain making to laundry organised strikes and formed unions with increasing frequency. The chain makers of Cradley Heath, the pit-brow women of the coal mines, the rope makers, and the jam factory workers, each group pushed back against conditions that had been accepted as unchangeable, and each push widened the crack just slightly. Now here's a curious detail that speaks to the particular barriers women faced in organising. Many existing trade unions in the Victorian era explicitly excluded women. The skilled trades carpentry, metalwork, printing were male domains, and their unions saw female workers not as allies, but as threats competitors who would accept lower wages and undermine hard-won bargaining positions. Women who wanted to organise had to build their own structures from scratch, often without money, without legal protections, and without the institutional knowledge that male unions had accumulated over decades. The Women's Trade Union League, founded in 1874 by Emma Patterson, was one of the first organisations to address this gap, but progress was agonisingly slow. By the turn of the century, only a tiny fraction of working women belonged to any union at all. Historians still debate why female labour organising remained so limited despite the obvious need. Some point to the practical obstacles women worked. Longer hours earned less money, had childcare responsibilities that made attending meetings difficult, and faced dismissal if their employers discovered union involvement. Others emphasise cultural barriers, arguing that the Victorian ideology of femininity, passive domestic self-sacrificing, made it psychologically difficult for women to see themselves as workers, with collective rights, rather than individuals whose suffering was simply part of the natural order. The Match Girls broke through that barrier with spectacular force, but for every factory that struck, there were hundreds of kitchens and washhouses and sewing rooms where women continued to work in silence, not because they lacked courage, but because courage without structure is just endurance by another name. You think about this as you walk home from the pump, the bucket of water heavy in your hand, the conversation with the watercress seller still turning over in your mind, a meeting, women talking about wages. The idea is both thrilling and frightening, like standing at the edge of a roof and looking down the view is extraordinary. But the fall is always possible. You have children, you have rent to pay. You cannot afford to lose what little you have in pursuit of what you deserve, and the gap between those two realities is where most revolutions go to die quiet, practical deaths. But the whisper stays with you. It settles into the back of your mind alongside the other things you carry, the hunger, the fatigue, the permanent ache in your lower back, the memory of your neighbour's laugh in the yard. It sits there quietly, not demanding anything, just present. A seed that may or may not find enough light to grow. And perhaps that is how change actually works. Not in the grand dramatic moments that make it into history books, but in the slow accumulation of whispers that eventually become too loud to ignore, in the watercress seller who mentions a meeting, in the seamstress who says no, in the laundress who names her price and holds it, in the 1400 match girls who looked at each other one morning and recognised in each other's faces the same exhaustion, the same fury, the same stubborn refusal to accept that this was all there would ever be. You set the bucket down inside your door. The water sloshes gently, catching the faint light from the window. Outside, the city continues its indifferent roar. But somewhere in the back room of a pub near Bow, women are still talking. And talking, you're beginning to understand, is where everything starts. She's sitting in the corner of the room when you visit, and at first you almost don't recognise her. The woman you remember was sturdy, broad-shouldered, with hands that could wring a wool blanket dry without help, and a voice that carried down the full length of the tenement hallway. That woman is gone now. In her place is someone smaller, folded into herself like a letter that has been read too many times, the creases so deep they've become permanent. Her hair is white and thin. Her eyes are cloudy. Her hands, those extraordinary tireless hands, rest in her lap like broken tools that no one has come to collect. She is 53 years old. She looks 70. This is what old age looked like for a poor Victorian woman, and it arrived early uninvited and without the courtesy of a gradual transition. There was no slow, gentle greying. There was work, and then there was the inability to work, and the space between those two states was terrifyingly narrow. One winter illness, one fall on icy cobblestones, one bout of bronchitis that settled into the chest and refused to leave. That was all it took to push a working woman from precarious self-sufficiency into complete dependence, and dependence in a world without pensions, without social security, without any institutional safety net beyond the workhouse, meant one thing: you were at the mercy of whoever would have you. Here is a mainstream historical fact that quantifies this vulnerability. The Old Age Pensions Act was not passed until 1908, and even then it provided only 5 shillings a week to people over 70 who met strict eligibility criteria. For the entire Victorian era, there was simply no state provision for elderly people who could no longer work. None. If you had family willing and able to support you, you survived. If you had savings, which almost no poor woman did, you survived. If you had neither, your options narrowed to 3: charity, the workhouse, or the street. And charity, as we've seen, came wrapped in sermons and moral judgment that could feel almost as cold as the pavement. You sit beside her and take her hand. The skin is papery and loose over bones that feel fragile beneath your fingers, like holding a bird. She smiles at you, a slow, effortful smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes, and asks about the children. She always asks about the children. It is her way of remaining connected to the living world, of reminding herself and you that she was once part of the current of daily life rather than stranded on its bank watching it flow past. Now here's a curious detail that reveals something quietly devastating about ageing in poverty. Many elderly women who could no longer perform heavy labour took on the lightest, lowest paid work available, minding babies for working mothers running small errands, selling matches or flowers on street corners. These were not careers. They were the last thin threads connecting a woman to economic existence. And when even these threads snapped, when the legs could no longer carry her to the corner, when the hands could no longer grip a matchbox, what remained was not retirement, but erasure. She simply disappeared from the economy as if she had never been part of it, which in the eyes of official records she largely hadn't. Historians still debate the lived experience of elderly poor women in the Victorian era, partly because the evidence is so sparse. Old women left few letters kept and no diaries appeared in census records as entries easily overlooked. Some social investigators, like Charles Booth in his monumental survey of London poverty in the 1890s, documented the conditions of the elderly poor with careful, compassionate detail. The tiny rooms, the inadequate clothing, the meals consisting of bread soaked in tea because teeth had long since failed. But even Booth's work captures only a fraction of the reality. The rest is silence, the particular silence of people whose suffering was so ordinary, so expected, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of daily life that no one thought it worth recording. The woman in the corner coughs. It's a deep, wet cough that seems to originate somewhere below her ribs and travel upward through her entire body, leaving her breathless and slightly trembling. You offer her water. She takes a sip and waves you off with a gesture that is both dismissive and grateful, the gesture of a woman who has spent a lifetime minimizing her own needs so that others might have more. Remember the mothers who ate last, who gave the thickest portion to the youngest child and scraped the bottom of the pot for themselves. She was one of those mothers decades ago. The habit never left her. Even now, diminished and dependent, she will insist she's not hungry when food is offered, will claim she's warm enough. When she's clearly shivering, will say she's fine with a conviction that fools no one but satisfies her pride. You pull the blanket, that scratchy mission hall blanket, from a few nights ago from your bag and drape it across her knees. She protests. You insist. The blanket settles around her like an argument she's too tired to win, and after a moment her hand moves to its edge and grips it gently, pulling it closer, accepting the warmth with the quiet reluctance of someone who's forgotten how to receive kindness, without feeling it as a debt. The room darkens as the afternoon fades. The light from the small window turns from pale grey to the deeper grey that precedes evening, and the shadows gather in the corners, like patient animals waiting to be fed. You sit together in the dimming light. She tells you a story, something from years ago, about a market day, a dropped basket, a stranger who helped her gather scattered apples and then tipped his hat and disappeared. It's a small story, inconsequential. But she tells it with a care that suggests it has been polished by years of retelling, each detail preserved like a pressed flower between the pages of a memory that is otherwise growing thin. You listen. That is all she needs. Someone to listen while the light fades and the cold creeps in, and the long, quiet work of disappearing continues one day at a time. Night falls over the rookeries like a hand pressing down on a candle flame, slow, deliberate, suffocating. The gaslight on the corner flickers once, twice, then steadies into a weak amber glow that reaches no further than a few feet in any direction, leaving the rest of the lane to darkness. You're walking home. The streets are different at night. The daytime bustle. The carts, the costermongers, the children darting between legs like small grubby fish has drained away, replaced by something quieter and more watchful. The buildings lean inward above you, their upper stories jutting out over the lane until they nearly touch, creating a narrow corridor of shadow that feels less like a street and more like a throat. Your footsteps echo. The cobblestones are slick with something you choose not to identify, and you walk carefully, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. The brick is cold and damp beneath your fingertips, slightly gritty, and you can feel the places where the mortar has crumbled away, leaving shallow gaps that catch your nails as you pass. The air smells of coal smoke and rotting vegetables and the sharp ammoniac tang of urine from the alley to your left. Somewhere ahead a door opens, briefly releasing a slice of yellow light, and the sound of voices low, murmuring indistinct before closing again and returning the street to its guarded silence. Here is a mainstream historical fact about the nocturnal geography of Victorian slums. The rookeries, dense, labyrinthine clusters of tenement housing in areas like St. Giles, Whitechapel and the Old Nickel were among the most overcrowded and poorly lit neighbourhoods in London. Some lanes were so narrow that two people could not walk abreast. Some courtyards received no direct sunlight at any time of day, existing in a permanent twilight that made them disorienting even to residents. At night, these spaces became almost completely dark, the few gas lamps that existed spaced so far apart that the pools of light they cast were islands in an ocean of black. For a woman walking alone, the darkness was not merely inconvenient. It was a landscape of vulnerability. You quicken your pace. Not running draws attention. And attention at night is something you have learned to avoid, but walking with the purposeful stride of someone who knows exactly where she is going and will not be stopping. Your eyes have adjusted to the dark enough to make out the shapes of doorways, the bulk of a parked cart, the outline of a figure leaning against a wall 20 yards ahead. You give the figure a wide berth crossing to the other side of the lane without looking directly at them, a manoeuvre so practiced it has become instinct. Now here's a curious detail about how poor women navigated the dangers of night. Many developed informal safety systems, walking in pairs or groups when possible, memorizing the locations of friendly doorways where they could knock if threatened learning, which pubs had landlords who would let a woman shelter inside without demanding payment. Some women carried small items for self-defense. A hatpin kept long and sharp was a common choice, discreet enough to avoid notice, but effective enough to discourage an unwanted hand. These were not dramatic precautions. They were the quiet daily calculations of women who understood that the streets they walked by day became a different country after dark, governed by different rules. Historians still debate the actual level of violent crime in Victorian slums versus the perception of it. Sensationalist journalism, particularly during the Whitechapel murders of 1888, painted the East End as a landscape of unrelenting danger, a place where violence lurked in every shadow. Some researchers argue that this portrayal was exaggerated, driven more by middle-class anxiety and newspaper sales than by statistical reality. Others counter that official crime statistics dramatically underrepresented the actual incidents of violence against poor women, since many assaults, domestic and otherwise, were never reported, never investigated, and never recorded. The truth characteristically resists a tidy conclusion. What is not debated is that poor women felt unsafe at night, and that this feeling shaped their movements, their choices, and their experience of the city in profound and lasting ways. You turn a corner, and your tenement comes into view. The relief is physical, a loosening in your chest, a softening of the muscles across your shoulders that you didn't realize you'd been holding tight. The building looks the same as it always does, dark, squat, unremarkable. But tonight it looks almost welcoming, the way any familiar place looks welcoming when you've been walking through uncertain territory. You push open the door. The hallway smells exactly as it always does, that thick layered cocktail of cabbage and damp and human proximity that greeted you on the very first morning of this journey. You breathe it in. It is not pleasant, but it is known. And known after a walk through the dark is a kind of safety. You climb the stairs. The wood creaks under your feet in the same places it always creaks a familiar music that your body knows by heart. Your door, your room. You step inside and close the door behind you, and the sound of the latch catching is small and ordinary and deeply privately satisfying. The children are asleep. You can hear their breathing slow and even undisturbed by whatever dreams visit the minds of children who have never known a life without hunger. The fire has burned down to a faint glow, barely enough to see by, but enough to cast a warm reddish light across their faces. You stand over them for a moment, watching, just watching. The rise and fall of small chests beneath thin blankets, the curl of a hand beside a cheek, the absolute trusting surrender of children asleep in a room they believe to be safe because you're in it. You lower yourself into the chair by the fire. Your body settles into it with the heavy gratitude of something that has been carried too long and is finally set down. The night outside continues its quiet business. Footsteps pass beneath your window and fade. A cat yowls, once distant and brief. The fire ticks softly as the last embers shift and settle. You are home, and for all that the word means in a place like this, cramped, cold, uncertain, it means enough. The embers glow. Faint amber barely holding on, but still warm if you lean close enough, still proof that something burned here, something real and necessary. You sit in the near darkness of your room, and you think about the women. Not one woman. All of them, the millions who move through this city like currents through deep water, invisible from the surface but carrying everything. You think about the servant girl on her knees at 5 a.m, scrubbing a grate with blackened hands so that a family she would never belong to could wake to warmth. You think about the laundress wringing sheets until her spine curved and her wrists locked and her hands became tools shaped by labour rather than by choice. You think about the seamstress sewing by candlelight, her eyes slowly failing, her fingers permanently bent around the ghost of a needle. You think about the mother who ate last, always last, who scraped the bottom of the pot and called it dinner and told herself the children ate and that was enough. You think about the match girl standing at her bench dipping splints into poison with mechanical precision, breathing in her own destruction one shift at a time. These women built an empire, not with speeches or legislation or military campaigns, but with the raw, unacknowledged labour of their bodies, scrubbing, sewing, hauling, nursing, carrying, enduring. The factories that powered Britain's Industrial Revolution were staffed by their hands. The grand houses of Mayfair and Belgravia were maintained by their invisible effort. The children who grew up to become soldiers, workers, citizens of the most powerful nation on earth, were fed and clothed and kept alive by women whose names appear in no history books and whose faces survive in no portraits. Here is a mainstream historical fact that carries the weight of everything we've walked through tonight. By the end of the Victorian era, women made up roughly 1/3 of the total British workforce, and that figure accounts only for documented employment. The true number, including the vast shadow economy of home-based piecework, casual labour, street selling and domestic work performed within the family, was almost certainly far higher. These women, were the invisible infrastructure upon which Victorian prosperity was built, and the empire that stood on their backs never once looked down to say thank you. Now here's a curious and quietly powerful detail. Among the few personal belongings that survived from poor Victorian women, objects recovered from workhouses, tenement clearances and archaeological digs are small, unexpected tokens of individuality. A pressed flower tucked inside a prayer book, a lock of a child's hair tied with ribbon, a chipped brooch pinned inside a dress where no one would see it, a letter never sent folded so many times the creases have worn through. These fragments speak louder than any official record. They say, I was here, I loved someone. I kept something beautiful in a life that offered very little beauty. I refused to be reduced to nothing. Historians still reflect on why the lives of poor Victorian women remained so thoroughly undocumented for so long. Some point to the biases of the historical profession itself, which for centuries prioritised the lives of the powerful, the wealthy and the male. Others note the practical obstacles poor women left few written records, and the records that did exist were often administrative rather than personal, reducing complex lives to entries in a workhouse ledger or a line in a census return. The recovery of these women's stories has been one of the great projects of modern social history, and it is still incomplete. For every life that has been reconstructed from fragments, thousands remain in silence, not because they were unimportant, but because no one thought to listen while they were still speaking. You lean back in your chair. The fire has dimmed to almost nothing now, just a faint pulse of orange in the grey ash, and the room has settled into a deep velvety darkness that softens everything it touches. The children's breathing is slow and steady, a rhythm as old and reliable as the tide. The sounds of the city outside have faded to a distant murmur. No carts, no voices, no factory bells. Just the low hum of a vast sleeping organism resting before tomorrow's demands arrive. And here now in the stillness a thought surfaces, gentle, unhurried, asking nothing of you. These women endured not because they were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary. Because endurance is what ordinary people do when the world offers no alternative. They woke before dawn. They worked until their bodies ached and their hands cracked and their eyes blurred. They fed their children before themselves. They laughed with neighbours over stale biscuits. They whispered about change in the back rooms of pubs. They grew old before their time and disappeared into silence, and the city continued without them as if they had never existed. But they did exist. Every cobblestone was worn smooth by their footsteps. Every chimney was kept burning by their hands. Every morning that the city woke and functioned and carried on was a testament to their labour, their patience, their stubborn, unsung refusal to stop. The fire dims. The room grows soft. The edges of everything blur gently, slowly, as if the world itself is deciding to rest. You're still here in this small room wrapped in the quiet. The blanket across your knees holds a borrowed warmth that seeps through the fabric and into your skin, and your breathing has slowed without you noticing, matching the rhythm of the sleeping children, matching the rhythm of the settling embers, matching the rhythm of the city as it exhales into the long, deep stillness of the night. Think of the women. Think of their hands roughened, cracked, endlessly working, and let them rest now. Let the scrubbing stop. Let the needle pause. Let the washtub grow still, and the factory bell fall silent and the heavy iron cool on the stove. They have done enough. They have carried enough. The cold outside does not reach you here. The walls, thin as they are, hold you gently. The darkness is not empty. It is full of the quiet breathing of children, full of the memory of laughter, in a courtyard full of the scent of weak tea and coal smoke and wool. These are small things, ordinary things, but they are the things that remain when everything else has been stripped away, and they are enough. They have always been enough. Your eyes are heavy now. Let them close. Let the tenement settle around you like a hand cupping a candle flame, protecting the last small light from the wind. The women who came before you, the servants, the seamstresses, the laundresses, the mudlarks, the matchgirls, the mothers, they are resting too somewhere in the deep quiet of history. Their work finally done, their hands finally still, their stories held gently in the memory of a world that is only now learning to listen. The fire is an ember. The ember is a glow. The glow is a warmth that lingers in your chest, like a whispered word you can't quite hear, but understand perfectly. Sleep now. The long day has ended. The long night holds you safe. Rest as they once did, not because the world was kind, but because even in the hardest lives there comes a moment when the body says enough, and the darkness opens its arms and sleep arrives like a mercy that asks nothing in return. Sweet dreams.